welcome. My name is Steve Scanlon. I'm in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. But first things first, before we get to that, there's a handout for the Wealth and Poverty theme, the certificate program. If you are at all interested in issues of wealth and poverty and inequality, take a look at your DARs. You're probably already on your way towards receiving the certificate. There's handouts in the back, some on the chairs as well. And if you have any questions about those, you can consult Dr. Young Kim. Wave your hand. Oh, with her mouth full, sorry. And she and Dr. Edna Wangui are the coordinators for that. Okay. Well, welcome. This is another speaker in our Wealth and Poverty theme, Poverty and Inequality Week that we have had now for 2 years. And we're very excited today to have one of our speakers talking about a very important issue in the topic of inequality, and that's education. And that person is Dr. Elizabeth Lee. Dr. Lee received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2011 and was hired here as faculty in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in 2014 after serving 2 years at Hamilton College. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Lee here. She definitely fills a gap in the sociology of education, not just in the Department of Sociology, but for the College of Arts and Sciences and the university as a whole in terms of carrying out these conversations. Dr. Lee's research and teaching interests include, of course, the sociology of education, as well as class and inequality, intersectionality and social stratification, research methods, as well as class mobility. In addition to numerous publications in very reputable journals, she's the co-editor with Chase, is it LaDusa?
It is.
I should have asked you about the last name instead of the first name. Chase LaDusa, titled College Students' Experience of Power and Marginality, and that's with Routledge Press. And then she's also the author of the forthcoming book through Cornell University Press called Class and Campus Life, Managing the Experience of Inequality at an Elite College. The title of our talk today, as you can see, is Inequality in the Education Pipeline. Please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Lee.
Thank you all. I understand that the back of the room is a little bit of a noise dead zone. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Fantastic. Okay. And to my wonderful capstone students who are here, I would like that now every time I start class. Thank you. So I'll be speaking, as you see, about inequality in the education pipeline, and I'm going to preface my remarks a little bit by talking about why I've chosen this title. So if you follow the news, you already know a little bit about what inequality in American education looks like. These pictures are recent posts to Twitter from teachers in the Detroit public schools who have taken to Twitter to try to publicize the conditions in which they are trying to teach and in which their students are trying to learn. So we know a little bit about what inequality looks like physically, right? We know that inequality manifests itself in the physical body of the school in terms of the financial and physical resources that are available. These are largely not the kinds of inequalities that I'm going to be speaking about today. Rather, I'm going to be focused on inequalities that unfold largely through interaction, particularly between students and the school that surrounds them, or the school which we hope is their community, right? In particular, teachers. And I'm going to be talking about the ways in which different types of inequality here. As a sociologist, this is probably not a surprise, I'm going to be focusing on race, class, and gender, the ways that inequalities unfold along those lines and accumulate over time. And I want to just sort of pause here and say that there are many different ways that we might think about school inequality, even within what I've just described, right? So for example, we might talk about standardized testing. And I'm not going to discuss comprehensively today all the different varieties, of course, of school inequalities, even within, as I said, the comments that I've already made. I'm going to be really focused on, in particular, school discipline, children and parents and their help-seeking activities, and expectations of students. and what their school futures might bring and how those are interpreted. So again, really focused around different types of interactions that students have with teachers and other interactions within a school community. Now, I tend to think about all of this from this perspective. As a researcher and as a teacher, I focus often on colleges and universities, as you've just heard in my kind introduction. And sometimes as a faculty member in particular, but even in my own thinking, it's frustrating for somebody who teaches about college inequality to try to understand, well, where does that come from, right? So if we're thinking about how do people move through 4 or more years of college, right? Or likelihood of graduation and different types of experiences that people might have or get from college, or even just who's here on a college campus, who makes it to college and who does not, right? Sometimes when students ask me or I think about this, well, okay, so how did students get to college in the first place? Let's track back a little bit. Okay, well, what was happening in high school? Okay, who had access to SAT prep classes? Who had access to honors courses or AP? Okay, well, let's look at how students enter high school. We'll go back to 8th grade, junior high, elementary school. And you're going to have to keep going all the way back. And very quickly, you've gone all the way back, right, to the earliest years of schooling. And this underlies something that is really foundational in thinking about our education system in the United States and in other places as well, and it's what underlies my pipeline imagery and title choice, right, which is that education is extremely sequential, right? In some ways this is, you know, I'm not telling you something new here, right? We know that second grade follows first grade is followed by third grade and so on. So in some ways this is may seem simplistic, but it's really profound for thinking about how does inequality happen and how does it unfold over time, right? So if we think about education as a pipeline, right, where students begin in their very earliest years of childhood, you know, maybe age 3, 4, 5, and follow potentially all the way through, certainly we might think to their late teens, and if we think about going to college, into their early 20s and maybe a little bit beyond that, right? This is our full childhoods, teenage years into our early adult lives, right? But we might also think about the ways in which when we encounter twists and turns in this pipeline, or we might think of them as leaks, right? The more a student is delayed or falls out of that pipeline, the more a student deviates from that pipeline, the more difficult it is to get back on track, right? And so again, what I want to be able to talk about today is the ways in which particular sources of inequality, race, class, and gender, unfold and are deeply fundamental for thinking about shaping how a student moves through this education pipeline in ways that are cumulative over more than a decade, right? Over potentially 2 decades, right? And the ways that we might think about what's happening here in the earliest years is really going to be important for what's happening over here over time, right? So we only have an hour, and my aim here, as I said, is not to be comprehensive, but rather to highlight data primarily from the last decade or so of sociological thinking that helps us to think about what does this pathway look like, and of course, where might inequality come into play, how does it take place over time. And I will leave time for questions at the end for particular points that I may not get to. So I'm going to start by thinking about, okay, what does it look like when we first begin education? These kids are actually a little bit older than 3-year-olds, right? These are maybe 4, 5, 6-year-olds. But I picked this because of the excitement on these kids' faces, right? So when kids start education, right, if we're talking about pre-K or kindergarten, right, kids are, by and large, excited about learning. They're excited to go to school. Here I'll quote from a study by Alexander and Entwistle, who are 2 really prominent sociologists in this area. They write that children in the primary grades are optimistic, eager to learn, and tend to form emotional attachments to their teachers. Okay, so in these early years, I think that's what we see, optimism. Moreover, they highlight that these early years are really special because that optimism, that sense of emotional attachment, that excitement fades. For all students, or for most students, but for some students in particular, and here I'll quote again, all these factors should heighten their receptiveness to school influence and are notably lacking in the upper grades, right? So as kids move through school, we see some of that, again, fade away. So what that tells us is that these early years are really important for thinking about what's going on in schooling. And again, even as a researcher of college, right, the opposite end of that spectrum, what's happening here is really significant for thinking about how do kids enter this long process of schooling, how do they form attachment not only to school as a place, but to a sense of themselves as students, to school as a place in which they belong, in which they fit, right? And of course, I'll just sort of pause here and say we could look as sociologists of education even earlier, right, for distinctions. We could look at access to pre-K, to quality pre-K, which is patterned in particular by family income, by race, by geography, where people live. We could look at parent vocabulary, how many words and what kinds of words do parents use with their kids before they begin school. We could look at nutrition all the way back to in the womb, right? But even ignoring all of that, as we come to this particular starting line, so to speak, as kids are entering school, they have this in common. They're excited about going to school. And in that sense, they share a starting line. Very quickly, however, we begin to see distinctions. And here I'll focus in particular on distinctions by gender and by race. I don't know if you all can read this in the back. These pink and blue notes for the female profile say, cooperation, my wedding, sweetie, quiet, love, nurturing. For the male figure, it says threat, direct commands, confrontation, thrill, competition, and now, exclamation point, right? And these are actually very evocative of the kinds of different, both messages that students get about themselves as gendered and often raced, or we might even also say classed, young people, and images that teachers, administrators, and in some cases parents have about their kids, right? So there's a iterative back and forth dynamic that's taking place. So already in these earliest years of school, we begin to see a shift from, sort of a bunch of kids coming in, they're excited, they're happy, and dividing lines, right, or different categories sort of arising. So we're in these earliest years of school, pre-K, kindergarten, early grade school, boys and girls, I'll start with gender, are getting different types of messages, are being treated differently with regard to discipline writ large and small, right? So discipline writ large, the kinds of discipline that kids get in terms of what we might think of in a sort of a formal sense, being sent to the quiet corner, being suspended or expelled even in these very 3-year-olds, 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, even in these very early years, being yelled at, being disciplined in, again, this formal way. Also in an informal way, right? So being redirected from particular activities into something that's more appropriate for your gender or your race. Being corrected. In the case of little girls in particular, being physically rearranged. There's a wonderful study by Karen Martin that documents in a pre-K classroom how teachers are likely to sort of tuck little girls' shirts in and readjust their tights and physically arrange them in ways that simply doesn't happen for boys. So speaking extremely broadly here, right, in these early years of schooling, boys are either likely to be getting more of this sort of formal discipline, okay, so they're getting harsher reactions from teachers, more punitive discipline, and or they're getting a pass on behavior that teachers might call boys being boys that will later get them in trouble when they do the same thing in subsequent years of school. Girls are getting sort of a softer but probably more pervasive form of discipline that essentially is training them to act like ladies, right? So to be ladylike, to be quiet, in many ways to be passive. So we might sort of categorize this under sort of gender socialization, right? The ways that teachers sort of teach kids in what's called the hidden curriculum to perform their gender appropriately. Depending on your feelings about gender, you may or may not find this disturbing. But we might also look at more troubling differences around these kinds of teacher-student interactions that result in the kinds of fairly extreme levels of punishment like suspension and expulsion, again, even at very early years of schooling. So here I'll refer to some data from the Yale University Child Study Center, looking at, again, preschools, and here I'll quote, "Boys were over 4 times as likely to be expelled as girls, and African American preschoolers are about twice as likely to be expelled as preschoolers of European descent." So again, both in terms of race and in terms of gender, we begin to see this happy mass of little kids excited about school beginning to be differentiated, and early signs of different pathways that they're going to take or be pushed into, we might say. So let me pause here and talk about this issue of discipline. This is a big part of the talk, and I'll come back to it several times. So let me pause here and talk about this for just a moment. So many of you, how many of you are familiar with the phrase school to prison pipeline? Okay, so many of you. So the idea of the school to prison pipeline, and I've borrowed from that imagery, of course, for my title today, is that schools are moving some children, particularly Latino and African American boys, rather than through schooling to college, to productive work careers, to jobs, basically directly into prison, okay, or into juvenile detention, okay, so that there's a pipeline, a very direct relationship between schools, school discipline, and very harsh kinds of outcomes, okay. So the school to prison pipeline is something that, of course, is at issue for and of great concern to not only sociologists, but of course also educators of all stripes, policymakers, teachers, parents, community members, right? And I want to just give a little bit more context to that in terms of the history. So I'm going to refer here to the Harvard University Civil Rights Project. They write that since the early 1990s, many school districts have replaced a system of graduated sanctions. So in other words, you do something once, you maybe get a little bit of trouble, you do it a second time, a little bit more trouble, third time, a little bit more trouble, and so on, right? So we've moved from this system of graduated sanctions to a zero tolerance approach. You do it the first time, that's it, right? And an approach to wrongdoing. The result is a near doubling of the number of students suspended annually from 1974 from 1.7 million to 3.1 million. I should pause here and say this is from a conference in 2003, so we might forecast that that number is considerably larger by now. An increase in the presence of police in schools, in the use of metal detectors and search and seizure procedures in school, and in the enactment of new state laws mandating referral of children to law enforcement authorities for a variety of school code violations, right? So we have this large discipline apparatus, a large system, part of which lives in schools and is very directly linked to out-of-school bodies, the state legislature, local law enforcement. And if we think about sort of popular discourse about schools, popular discourse about what are people concerned about schools, certainly we might think of in an age of frighteningly large numbers of school shootings, security and crime might not be very far from our minds, right? So we might think, okay, there's a certain logic here. Maybe we have higher crime rates, so we have a greater likelihood of having a police presence. But studies show that this relationship is actually not very direct, or certainly it's not direct in terms of hinging on the kinds of things that we think police should be involved in, namely crime and particularly violent crime. Rather, these trends of increased policing, increased zero tolerance policies are concentrated in racially segregated, primarily low income, primarily non-white schools and communities, right? So they're applied much more often in particular types of settings. And in fact, a recent study, this is actually coming out in 2016, but the sort of online version of the paper was out just a few months ago, found that the demographics and specifically the race makeup of a school has a determinative effect above and beyond the factors that we would associate with policing, like school crime or community crime, okay? So in some cases, decisions about where to bring in school police or special resource officers are not being made about actual dangers or risks. Rather, they're being made about associations of risk with particular types of students, namely, usually low-income African American and Latino students. As the study's authors wrote, these results suggest that the implementation of security measures are at least partially based on the perceived threat of African American student populations rather than any objective dangers within crime or misconduct taking place at the school or in the neighborhood, i.e. neighborhood crime that surrounds the school. That's by Servos and Finn, and as I said, forthcoming. I recommend it. So we might think about discipline as looking like this, but we also want to sort of be cognizant of sort of the roots and broader relationships here. We might also think about discipline in regard to our sort of question of educational inequality in several different types of ways. And here I want to focus on this last one in particular, right? So if we're thinking about education as a pipeline that takes us from pre-K potentially to college, right? We know that if you are expelled from school, if you have a school record with a great deal of suspensions or misdemeanors, if you get written up, it goes on your permanent record, right? If you're expelled, that's going to cause problems, right? So that may result in barriers to, probably will result in barriers to immediate enrollment in college right after high school, right? So those are two real factors. I want to focus in this talk on this last one, though. The idea that interactions with the disciplinary apparatus of a school, the experience of getting in trouble, or not even actually getting in trouble, but being seen as a suspicious body, is an experience that results in some students having a bad relationship with school, with understanding school as a place in which they do not belong, with understanding school as a place in which they are not affirmed, not legitimated, potentially, essentially not welcomed, right? And a different self-understanding for their capacities to be strong students, for their capacities to think about staying in school into and through college. So in this area, I've focused just now in my comments about discipline, particularly on race, and I'll pause here to say that we also see really strong differences here by gender, as I sort of implicated in my discussion of the pre-K suspensions. So girls are much less likely to be expelled, much less likely to be suspended, including for behavior that is the same as the kinds of behavior that gets boys expelled and suspended. So when girls have physical fights, when girls assault somebody, when girls yell, when girls cuss out the teacher or do other types of things that are not appropriate school behavior, right? Those are much less likely to result in them having these kinds of sort of punitive formal actions. Rather, they tend to be more likely to be sort of written off or underplayed as being about boys or about romance, and it's just girl stuff, in ways that, as somebody not working in a high school, sounds surprising and a little bit bizarre. So basically, girls' violence is seen essentially as unserious, not really something that needs to be worried about. And I'll come back to both of these issues in a little bit. Oops, and I have my wife did the animations for me. I'm not used to them being there, so if I pause and am surprised by my own animations, that's why. So let me deviate a little bit from my discipline theme here and talk about parent expectations. And I like to talk about this in particular because, especially when we're talking about young kids, right? Part of what we might talk about is the role of parents, right, as really formative. And often, again, if we think about sort of public discourse or scholarly discourse or policy discourse about what sort of helps kids or makes kids do well in school or do badly in school, a lot of times we might talk about parents. Well, what are their parents doing, right? And so we have a sense that, if parents have high expectations for getting homework done, for, saying, I expect you to do well in school, I expect you to go to college, right? That's going to result in strong school performance, and vice versa if parents have low expectations, if they, don't sort of evince that kind of care to their kids, that's going to result in poor school performance. And generally, by and large, this is found sort of true in many decades of sociological studies, that generally speaking, parent expectations, strong parent expectations have a positive effect for students' school outcomes. However, we want to be really cautious about thinking about parent expectations as sort of a magic bullet or a panacea. In other words, we want to be really cautious about saying, well, what's going on for this kid? Why aren't they doing well? Well, their parents must have really not good expectations, or their parents aren't doing their job, right? So here I'm quoting Alexander and Entwistle again. They write that expectations are simply not sufficient in the absence of larger bodies of resources, right? So expectations are likely to have an impact when they are, quote, coupled with appropriate activities, okay, when parents are involved in schooling and learning in other ways, at home, and with the tangible resources needed to realize those expectations. In other words, expectations do not function as well in a vacuum, right? They're not in and of themselves sufficient. When high expectations are detached from such resources, they prove less useful, right? So again, we want to be really careful about how we think about parents and our expectations for the roles that parents play. So let's jump forward a little bit and look at sort of middle school years. So we'll come back to our discipline thread here. So in many ways, what we see is simply a continuation of the patterns that we already noted in the earliest years of schooling, right? With strong differences in terms of kids' experiences in school and their outcomes in school in terms of race and gender, and less evidently in this visual by class. So this comes from a policy paper by Skiba and his colleagues, who found that, for example, this is North Carolina state figures, the black students who were first-time offenders were much more likely to be suspended than white offenders. And I'm air quoting offenders here because of the types of offenses that students are being penalized for, like displays of affection, dress code violations, right? So again, when we're thinking about a dress code violation and suspension or expulsion, I think that's a stretch to call that an offense. And this echoes broader national level findings, right? In other words, this is not just North Carolina that's having this issue, right? So the National Education Policy Center writes that a study of racial and gender disparities in school punishments in an urban setting found that white students were referred to the office, in other words, they got in trouble more frequently for offenses that are relatively easy to document objectively. In other words, you did it or you didn't do it, one or the other. Okay, so for example, smoking, vandalism, leaving without permission, and using obscene language. You had the cigarette, you didn't have the cigarette, one or the other, right? African American students, however, were referred more often for behaviors that seem to require more subjective judgment on the part of the person making the referral. So these types of things. So disrespect, excessive noise, threatening behavior, and loitering, okay? So what this tells us is that part of discipline is really in the eyes of the beholder. It lies in an interaction between a person assessing a disciplinary infraction, a threat, a risk, problematic behavior, and the person who is or is not doing that behavior, right? Discipline is not only this objective yes-no, it lies in the interaction. So, let's see, I'm watching the time. So African American boys and girls are both more likely to be suspended than white girls and boys. Girls more than 4 times as likely, boys more than 3 times as likely. And as is implicated in the visual here, most suspensions and expulsions are actually not for the kinds of offenses that we would probably understand collectively in public or in this room as being particularly serious or threatening. Rather, 95% of the kinds of offenses that students get suspended or expelled for are categorized as disruptive behavior or other. Okay? So we see that there are profound differences, right, in terms of the experiences students are having in early years of school, in middle school, largely patterned by race and by gender and how the two come together. And we might also sort of pause and think about teacher expectations, right? So teachers also, of course, play a really important role here. In fact, some studies show that even in households where parents don't have particularly high expectations or active participation in student schooling, teachers with high expectations can actually kind of fill in that gap and make up the difference. However, we also want to pause and acknowledge that teachers are human beings like everybody else and are subject to the same sort of broad social structures and social understandings, the same kinds of prejudices, classism, racism, gender bias that pervades American society. So this quote comes from fieldwork by Anne Arnett Ferguson. It's in her book, Bad Boys, and she was interested in understanding how is it that some particular students are understood as bad kids, right? Not just bad students, they don't get good grades, but they're bad kids. So she writes about going to a particular elementary school and that one of the adults working in the school pointed out a young boy who's African American and says, that one has a jail cell with his name on it. And she said, this is a 10-year-old, he's like, this tall, he's skinny, he's a little kid, right? So it's easy to sort of think about the sort of quantitative, the national level data that I've just showed you, the patterns of who is likely, more and less likely to be expelled or suspended, and qualitative data like this. If this is how this teacher understands this little 10-year-old boy, how we might think about particular behaviors being interpreted, right, as more or less threatening. It's also easy to sort of forecast if this is this teacher's views on this particular student or his students generally, how that might shape this teacher's interactions with their students, or for that matter, with the students' parents, right? So let me, again, deviate from my discipline theme and speak briefly about help seeking. So as we see here, we might think of a classroom, particularly once we get to middle school, with students being really active, sort of putting their hands up. I thought about putting in a picture of Hermione Granger, kind of like this, right? So we might have kids who are really active, what I like to think of as sort of self-advocates, right? When they encounter a situation where they don't know what to do, they get help, or they go find the teacher and say, what am I supposed to do? Some cases, even where they kind of do know what to do, but they just want the teacher to kind of confirm that they're doing the right thing. So there's wonderful work by Jessica McCrory-Calarco, and she did field work in classrooms largely like this, right, where in particular she was focused on class differences. So there were students from working class backgrounds and students from middle class backgrounds. And what she documents is that the middle class students largely look like this, right? If they encounter a problem, or even a hint of a problem, they're ready to ask, they're ready to advocate for themselves. What do I do? Or to go up and show the teacher and say, on problem 12, is this the instruction? I'm not clear. The working class students are maybe more like these two, right? They are not comfortable asking for help. They are reluctant to ask for help, either by raising their hands or by going to get the teacher's attention, right? So they're more likely to ask a peer who may or may not have very good advice about what to do, or to just sit and try to work it out themselves, right? So Calarco says, both of these are legitimate ways of handling a situation where you don't know what to do, and she points out that often the teachers really wished the middle class kids would sit down and just try to work it out themselves, whereas the working class kids, sort of trying to figure out what to do. But she says, despite teachers sort of uniform directions to all the class, everybody, come ask me if you have help, or their expressions of equal support to all these students, because of this comfort and propensity for seeking help or lack of comfort and propensity for seeking help, ultimately, these students are getting different things from the classroom. Same classroom, same teacher, same attitudes, but the students are more and less well able to really make effective use of their learning time in this classroom, right, because of their relationship to help seeking. This largely mirrors the ways in which we see parents able to help their kids. So Leroux, Annette Leroux is maybe the sociologist that most is read even outside of sociologist classrooms in the US these days. And what Leroux is really interested in is the same kind of question, but at the parent level. How are parents from different class positions able to support their students, and how are they able to interact with schools? What she found is that, again, very similarly, parents from middle class backgrounds, because of their education levels, because of their social circles, because of their work experiences, were very comfortable seeking help, advocating for their kids. Parents from working class backgrounds who did not share social circles with the teachers, who did not have equivalent education levels to teachers, and who understood teachers as being the expert in child education, were much less likely to question teachers, to make requests of teachers, and ultimately to advocate for their children. Leroux points out that this is most important around times of really significant transition. So, for example, getting your child tested or retested, perhaps, for a learning disability, or to be moved up a grade, or contesting a school decision to hold your child back a grade, right? Or even changing teachers, getting your kid moved out of a classroom where they maybe don't feel comfortable with the teacher into a classroom where they do. So middle class parents know that these are possibilities. They're comfortable making them happen. They're comfortable pursuing them. And they're comfortable being really persistent. Working class parents, much less so. And ultimately, again, she says neither of these is the right way, quote unquote, to parent, but one is more efficient in terms of dealing with a school system, and they have different types of outcomes for students in terms of what that parent help can provide. So let's think about high school. Here I'll come back to some qualitative data. So by the time we get to high school, we're really seeing the accumulation of these kinds of patterns that have unfolded over time. And we might think about that in multiple ways, right, in terms of how kids have been tracked into different types of courses. Are they going to enter in earth science or bio? Are they going to enter in algebra 2 or pre-algebra, right? But also in terms of, again, the kinds of social experiences and interactions that they're having and that they're expecting from school as a place where they do or don't belong. So Ed Morris did qualitative research fieldwork in a couple of schools, and he was particularly interested in the disciplinary experiences of children by gender and by race. I'll focus on the boys. And he says they're very different expectations are evident in students' interactions with teachers. So in this case, he highlighted a situation where Latino high schooler is sort of wrestling in class with a peer. They're kind of goofing off. And the teacher in that classroom says, you better cut it out. You're going to stop it. And the boy says, I'm just goofing off. I'm not hurting the kid. It's not a fight, right? And the teacher told him, stop anyway. And he says, one day you're going to hurt someone and not know it, and you're going to go to jail. So he goes right from sort of horseplay wrestling to you're going to go to jail, right? This particular boy doesn't wear any markers of gang affiliation, typically used at the school, but the teacher, Mr. Pham, still interpreted his actions as overly aggressive and warned that they can one day land him in jail. By contrast, Morris writes about an experience with an Asian American student who wears all blue, which is a local signal of a gang involvement, and in fact, as he says, calmly informs him one day that he is in fact a member of a gang, right? And yet he is never, he's not seen by teachers in the same way, right? He's not highlighted or understood as threatening, as likely to be in a gang, as dangerous, right? And so he concludes, even when Asian American boys, such as Roshan, exhibit specific markers, right, associated with gang affiliation, and in this case actually were affiliated with gangs, educators still didn't view them as threatening or dangerous, especially when compared to Latino boys. And this manifests itself in more routine ways as well. For example, some kids are their infractions, even minor infractions, sort of picked up on and highlighted. So in this case, an African American administrator sees a short black boy who's walking by, his shirt's not tucked in. This is a school with uniforms, of course, right? And she tells him, you know, tuck in your shirt, get to class, okay? Same hallway, right? There's another student who's white who, he says, roams by. We sort of get the sense of sort of wandering around, meandering. He doesn't have his shirt tucked in. He doesn't have homeroom in this hall, so he shouldn't even be there, right? But the teacher does not tell him to tuck his shirt in. She doesn't tell him to go to class. She's like off the radar, right? She's not picking up on his behavior as problematic in the same way as she's picking up on it for the other student, okay? Julie Betty does very similar work looking at high school girls. In the book that I'm using here, she talks about Latina and white girls in a California school who are from middle class and working class backgrounds, right? And broadly, what she writes echoes this very same kind of pattern, right? So the white middle class girls are largely legitimated, affirmed by teachers who treat them with a great deal of respect, who expect them to go to college and who talk to them about college. They win all the awards in the school, she points out. And often the teachers sort of share with them their feelings about the working class Latina students in the school, which is, you know, they're not going anywhere, quote unquote, right? She says for the Latina working class students in the school, they are largely tracked early on into vocational education. And she says when she went to this school to begin her field work, and she asked teachers, you know, what kind of classrooms could I go to meet working class Latina students? She'd already been introduced to other classrooms where other kinds of students were likely to be. She said, when I wanted to talk to girl students about their aspirations beyond high school, teachers shook their head and laughed together in a knowing way, and one man joked they'll all be barefoot and pregnant after high school, right? So, and I meant to note this earlier, I don't bring these in to sort of throw teachers under the bus, right? As a teacher, I know that teachers have extremely difficult jobs. I'm not a parent, but as an aunt, I know that parents have extremely difficult jobs. And for that matter, I know that students have difficult jobs and administrators. I highlight each of these roles so that we can think about each of these players as having a role in these communities, right? So again, not throwing the teachers under the bus. So I want us to be able to think about, again, my question about if we start here, this end of the pipeline, we have different types of experiences through the pipeline. What are the long-term outcomes of those experiences, right? And we've talked about suspensions and expulsions, the way that we might be sort of deviated away out of the pipeline, we might leak out of the pipeline. But we might also think again about how this shapes perceptions of schooling and the way that we can participate in schooling. So this comes from Nancy Lopez, who did field work largely with Dominican and Caribbean high schoolers and young adults after high school. And she found that when she asked these young adults to look back on their high school experiences, boys and girls had very different memories. So for boys, it was largely of suspicion and of conflict, right? So the teachers and security guards treat you not like an adult, but condescendingly, like you're stupid, and they thought of you as a kid. Girls, on the other hand, or young women at this age, I should say, remembered their interactions with teachers as largely positive. They would joke around. They would give them tips about jobs or maybe even hire them themselves during the summer. So school was a place in which they felt welcomed and affirmed. So we're getting close to time, so I'm going to speed up ever so slightly, but I want to be able to talk about this final end of the pipeline, right? And in the US, we would think about college in most cases as the far end of the education pipeline, right? Both in the sense that for most adults, completing college is the maximum education they're going to receive, but it's also what we know supports many of the types of adult outcomes that we want to be able to see people having. So for example, a middle class wage, right? So this is from the Pew Center just recently showing the earnings discrepancies between, for folks who have a bachelor's degree or more, and folks who have a 2-year degree or no degree, right? And actually this is only a larger difference now than it has been in past generations, right? And they note that college degrees are also associated not only with earnings, but also lower likelihood of unemployment, lower likelihood of living at or below the poverty line, lower likelihood of moving home and living with your folks, greater job satisfaction, right? College degrees are associated with family formation and lower likelihoods of divorce, higher likelihoods of marriage, right? So there's a wide array of adult outcomes that we would associate with successfully completing this other end of the college, of the education pipeline, right? Despite concerns about, debt and is college still worth it? So college enrollment patterns, as you probably already have a sense of, when we get to college and we think about who is entering college, this is when all of this school inequality really, for me as a college researcher, becomes manifest, right? So we know that who enters college is largely patterned by income, by race, by class. Overall, middle and particularly upper income students are much more likely to go to 4-year colleges and to begin college right after high school, which is a factor that is really strongly related to actually completing a college degree, and that's regardless of race or ethnicity or gender. Female students are much more likely to enroll in college, 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, right after high school, and this is particularly so in underrepresented racialized minority groups, so African Americans, Latino, Latinas, Native Americans, and some groups of Asian American students, both in 2- and 4-year programs. And in particular, because of the way that race and income and wealth are so deeply interrelated in the U.S., African American, Latina, Latino, and Native American students in particular are less likely to enroll in college than white students and other communities of Asian American students, right? So by the time we get to the sort of finish line, well, it's not even a finish line, just getting into college, we have really sort of reaped the benefits is clearly not the word, the outcomes of the inequalities that I've been talking about today. So we're just about 10 of, and I want to close with time for questions. So I'll share just one final slide. So what does all of this mean? There's a study recently by Hawksby and Avery that finds that there are tens of thousands more students every year, high school seniors, who are low income and high achieving, who could be going to selective or highly selective colleges and universities, but who do not apply to any college or university, or who don't apply to selective colleges or universities, right? So they're, in some ways, for college researchers, kind of falling off the map. And their description of these students, in many ways, I think, sort of encapsulates my larger point here about inequality in the pipeline, which is that if we're looking at college and who is entering college, there are many, many, many more students who are intellectually capable, who are academically motivated, who could be sort of moving into college, but for reasons that have accumulated across all of the prior years of education are not likely to do so, partly because of this idea of they don't have a desire to do so, or they don't see college as a possibility, right? And partly because of the other kinds of factors that I've spoken about today. And we want to be able to think about this outcome not only in terms of what it means for that individual student and his or her family, but this is really part of how inequality in the United States, in terms of income, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, right, is perpetuated, is maintained, or reproduced across generations, right? And that's something that we are clearly need to be concerned about, not only with regard to education, but with pretty much everything else that sociologists talk about, right? This is a really broad scale issue, and we see here just one small piece. So I'll close here and take any questions that people have. Thank you.
Any questions? the discipline differences,
Yeah.
especially early on, that
Yeah.
boys face compared to girls, and
Yeah.
how men and boys generally face more formal disciplinary
Yeah.
actions, which can then lead to greater influence on their personal record
Yep.
and permanent record.
Mhm.
So, like, is that somewhat to blame for the higher amount of females in education?
Yes, I think that is a factor. So if we're talking about the likelihoods of young women enrolling in college right after high school or ever at all, yes, I think that the discipline differences, not just in early years, but across the school years, in terms of record and in terms of sort of wanting to stay in school or seeing school as a good place to be, yeah, that is a factor.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. And my question is that you said that the college education is worth more today.
Yeah.
The college degree is for the enormous value. But then it's a bit odd though, because there are more and more colleges.
Mhm.
More colleges, more majors, Ohio
Mhm.
University is creating new majors, and so new colleges are created, so then supply is growing, and then more demand is growing. So in that case, in the market principle, college cost, tuition has to go down rather than go up. So then that's the question. People keep saying that college degrees hold a lot of barriers. You have to go to college and finish them, but the cost has been very prohibitive for low-income families.
Absolutely. The cost is very prohibitive, and college costs, if you sort of compare them with other types of costs, they've skyrocketed and they've gone up much faster than other cars or homes or consumer goods, right? So this is, to some extent, a complicated interplay between the ways that we expect families to pay for college or students to pay for college, the types of costs that a college education includes, and as you say, the supply and demand relationship between students and colleges. So colleges are much more expensive now, but we have considerably larger financial aid programs that support, for some families at least, paying the cost of that college. Those are largely loans, so ultimately it is still the student or family that pays it, but by comparison to 1970, when we had the Pell Grant and maybe the Stafford loan, and those would cover the whole thing. Now we have much larger loan limits, multiple types of loans, multiple types of grants. So there are multiple ways to pay for college that didn't exist before, right? We also know that the costs of not having a college degree are higher, so the available job market and the wages that one can earn without a college degree are on average lower, and the jobs that pay a substantial wage or a living wage without a college degree are harder to get because of changes in the economy overall and the types of jobs that are available, right? And our public discourse around college has really shifted to reflect that. We might also look at, again, the kinds of things that you pay for when you pay for college. So rather than simply paying for tuition and maybe room and board, costs of college now really include a much broader array of student services, administrative bodies, all the kinds of things that we might now associate with college that we didn't used to, a generation or two generations ago, like student services, right, and fancy dormitories and meal plans that are gourmet and those kinds of things, or for that matter, like really extensive career advising and study abroad programs. So it's different on all of those levels. Yes?
I find it interesting that in a lot of the studies that I've read and stuff in sociology, it seems that in terms of gender differences, women are more marginalized, especially when you look at the job place and pay gap and stuff. And yet, when you're looking in schools, it seems that it's actually the males that are being more disciplined and stuff. So where do you think that transition happens?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think you're exactly right. This is sort of a standout area in sociology where we often think about marginalization or power, right? as being sort of the opposite of what I'm talking about here. And certainly some sociologists who are writing about the ways that girls are disciplined, even in these sort of softer ways of having their shirts retucked in, talk about the ways in which those are not necessarily beneficial for girls or even positive experiences for girls. Rather, they're largely directed at becoming ladylike, which not every girl, frankly, wants to be. Thank you very much. So I'm not saying that these are positive kinds of outcomes, but certainly they're probably more pleasant than being kicked out of your classroom, right? And in some ways, the kinds of relationship between genders that you're describing, we still see in education when we talk about college and returns to college, right? So if we look at where people major, or for that matter, where they enroll in terms of different types of schools, we still see patterned gender differences that result in very different outcomes in terms of wages. So fewer women engineers, fewer women computer scientists, fewer women in the STEM fields generally, fewer women, I think business schools we might now be achieving parity. And even within the fields that women and men go to college or get professional degrees for, women are likely to be pediatric doctors rather than oncologists. And so we still see big wage differences that come about despite women sort of surpassing men in a statistical sense in terms of four-year college degrees and many graduate degrees. So there is still a great deal of gender inequality that doesn't favor women and girls. But certainly in terms of expulsions, I think that this comes back to gendered ideas about how we understand and interpret people's behavior as threatening or not threatening.
Thanks a lot.